So here we are in the second of three PowerPoints, the last classes that we've named in summary. And let's go on to the next slide. Last week, this is a summation of the three PowerPoints. Last week, we took a look at my re-narrating and reconstructing Christianity, spirituality, and religion project. And what we're trying to do is both say farewell and also thank all of you for 2.5 years of absolute delight in teaching on Wednesdays, preaching on Sundays, and having Sunday forums facilitation. And so what we're trying to do is summarize all that. And that first slide of the white Jesus visiting the white Adam and Eve in the Peace of the Kingdom actually came from Ilia Delio. And then part two tonight is living with a historical Jesus as opposed to a colonizer Jesus. And that's the Jesus in the headdress there, the heroic Jesus thought leaders, or the heroic thought leaders about Jesus of the 20th century. That's what we're going to cover tonight. Most of these people have done the bulk of their work in the 20th century. And next week, we're going to go to the 21st century and asking the question, where are spirituality, religion, and theology going in the 21st century? We're going to have a little conversation with the pioneers of the future, and it's going to be about living with the mystical cosmic Christ and the God of science and the God in science. So that's the agenda for last week, this week, and next week. Next slide, Wesley. So last week, this was a pretty startling slide, I thought, and got a good deal of response. And LaFawn, this is where I'm picking up from you and what you said that last Wednesday, and a wonderfully meaty email from Roland Maloney about what he'd like to see us cover. And rather than go through all of those different points from that slide, that we did go through all the points last week, what I want to do tonight is in response to LaFawn's question, what are the resources for that? And once I got this question from Roland, I said, you know what I could do? This is old hat to me because I lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s about historical Jesus scholarship. But I need to let these people know who all these people who were contributing to this kind of distinction. So this differentiation between colonizer Jesus and historical Jesus simply could not have happened without all of this great groundbreaking thinking and writing of 5 people we're going to cover tonight: Howard Thurman, Jack Spong, Marcus Borg, Dominic Crossan, and Joan Chittister. And the kind of the overall focus is the religion of Jesus as opposed to the religion about Jesus. And in the early part of the 20th century, there was a huge amount of energy coming toward the project of talking about who was the historical Jesus, what was his religion that he practiced, as opposed to the dogmas and systematic theology about Jesus. Let's look at how Jesus worshiped, how Jesus lived, what his practices were. So that's what that wonderful question from LaFawn and the wonderful email from Roland stimulated in me in presenting tonight's slide stack. So let's go to the next one. So these are the 5 people we're taking a look at. The black and white photo of Howard Thurman, above him, Marcus Borg, to his left, John Shelby Spong, underneath him, Sister Joan Chittister, both when she wore a habit and now in her current garb, and then beneath her, John Dominic Crossan. And I got curious about when these people were born, and everybody was born in the 1930s or before, except for Marcus Borg, and he was born in 1948. And he is deceased. He's the only one of these 5 who are, of these 4 who are deceased. And then when you add Howard Thurman, who was born in 1899 and lived to 1981, what you have is a really great eclectic group of writers who were notably courageous. And we'll talk about their courage when we talk about each one. And each one broke new ground within their own religious communities. And they impacted many facets of religion, theology, and spirituality. Not only in looking at who the historical Jesus was and what the impacts of that are on God and the church and the Holy Spirit, but also the place of religion in the culture. And they were bound together by these resonant claims about the importance of focusing on Jesus' religion, not the religion about Jesus. Now, we could have added so many more to this list, most notably Elaine Pagels, who teaches Princeton, great scholar of the Gnostic Gospels and early Christianity. I commend her to you if you're not familiar with her. We've talked about her and we've had her in forums twice. She was the last person who joined us physically when we could have an indoor physical gathering, March of 2020. So, next slide. Let's get started with Dr. Thurman. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Thurman, and he's not a household name, and I would love for him to be such. He was a mystic. He emphasized spiritual experience over everything. He wrote a groundbreaking book, Jesus and the Disinherited. That book informed the Jesus of the Civil Rights Movement. It is said that many people carried that in their attaché cases all the time, including Martin Luther King Jr. He was actually Martin Luther King Jr.'s spiritual director. When Martin Luther King Jr. would get low, he would get on a plane, so oftentimes with Coretta Scott King, his wife, and fly to San Francisco to be with Howard Thurman, and he would counsel him and give him spiritual counsel. And he's the first person that I'm aware of who had a pretty high profile, who talked about the colonizing Jesus. And let's talk about the story of that. To get there, let's just kind of take a look at the fact that he grew up in the African American Baptist Church in Florida. I talked about his being a spiritual director to King, played a critical role as a behind the scenes leader in the development of an alternative to violence and the dismantling of racial injustice in America. He, like Toni Morrison, didn't get out in the streets much. They felt that their role was behind the scenes. She in writing this beautiful, what I call sacramental language, and he offering spiritual counsel. Barbara Brown Taylor has written an amazingly inspiring chapter about Howard Thurman in Gregory Ellison's book, Anchored in the Current, discovering Howard Thurman as educator, activist, guide, and prophet. She says, oh, I'm sorry, before I get to her, Thurman notably said, dogmas and creeds and doctrines are created by the mind. These are the creations of the mind and are therefore always after the fact of the religious experience. And thus they are always out of date. The religious experience is what is always current, always fresh. In it, I hear God's voice in my own tongue and in accordance with the grain in my own wood. Now that is a brilliant poetic statement about the power of God's incarnation. God comes to you and me with the word of love and grace in a way that comes with the grain of our own wood. I love it. Well, that's worth pondering. Now to the Barbara Brown Taylor quote. She said, Howard Thurman was a Christian mystic. Everything he said, wrote, taught, and did flowed from a single source. And that source was his direct and incontrovertible encounter with the divine. That was how he discovered the really real. I love the fact that she capitalized those two words. which funded or resourced his courage. Now, that's worth a retreat day right there. That when you and I are in touch with the really real, that is our resource for our courage. And she goes on to say, the courage to challenge the unreal in all of its guises, injustices, unkindness, unreconciliation, unfreedom, in her own poetic way of writing. Next slide. So here is the book by Howard Thurman that was carried around by everybody. And it came, and he describes in this book a transformational journey to India. You know, so many of us have these transformational journeys, and his was to India in 1935. He went to India and he met with Gandhi. And at the time, India was struggling for independence from British colonialism. And all of us know that Gandhi played a huge leverage-oriented role in that liberation. There was another Hindu man who challenged Thurman in this way. He said the men who bought the slaves were Christians, Christian ministers, quoting the Christian apostle Paul, who gave the sanction of religion to the system of slavery. Some 70 years or more ago, you people in America were freed by a man, Abraham Lincoln, who was not a professing Christian. And during all the periods since then, you have lived in a Christian nation in which you were segregated, you were lynched, and you were burned. Even in the church, I understand, this Hindu man in India said to Howard Thurman, there is segregation. He goes on, one of my students who went to your country sent me a clipping telling about a Christian church in which the regular Sunday worship was interrupted so that many could join a mob against one of your fellows. When he had been caught and done to death, they came back to resume their worship of their Christian God. Later, Thurman wrote, the Christian movement, in order to be respectable and secure, must be on the side of the strong against the weak. And what he's talking about is whenever we desire for Christianity to be endorsed by, let me use the metaphor of Caesar, of the government, then it is its propensity to take the side of the strong against the weak. This reveals to what extent a religion that was born of a people acquainted with persecution and suffering has become the cornerstone of a civilization and of nations whose very position in modern life has too often been secured by a ruthless use of power applied to weak and defenseless peoples. Now, that is Isabel Wilkerson's first pillar of caste, and it actually is illustrated by what were the founding values and principles of the University of the South at Sewanee, and what the Robeson Center has been studying about the bishops who founded the University of the South at Sewanee, who were enslavers, who owned human beings as property, and how this was their raison d'etre, and how now the staff and I was about to say the vestry, the board of directors of the board of trustees have disassociated themselves from those values. So that's a summation of it right there, which Thurman heard in 1935 when he was in India from another Hindu who had been reading clippings from newspapers from the US. He goes on to say, it is the sin of pride and arrogance that has tended to vitiate the missionary impulse and to make of it an instrument of self-righteousness on the one hand and racial superiority on the other. Next slide. Now, I want to interrupt the flow of this conversation and description about the book, Jesus and the Disinherited, by going to this slide that has a picture of Thurman with this quote. It's from a very famous speech that he gave at Spelman, and it is called The Sound of the Genuine Speech, in which he said, it behooves every human being to be able to go beneath the level of quiet down to the level of stillness, because at the level of stillness is where you find the sound of the genuine. And the sound of the genuine is who you need to obey. So the quote here is, there is something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. I would hazard a guess that everybody on the screen tonight knows that, what it feels like to give your power over to somebody else who pulls the strings of your life. Now, to go back to the Jesus of the disinherited, Thurman was saying that this was the temptation of Jesus because he lived in Palestine, which then was under Roman occupation. So Jesus had to come to terms with whether or not the Roman occupiers were going to pull his strings, or whether Jesus was going to obey the sound of the genuine inside of him. Now that's how you all letting me do this PowerPoint tonight, and the research I did helped me make this connection, which I had not made until this afternoon or this morning when I made this PowerPoint. So Jesus determined the quality of his inner life, not someone or something else. So Jesus and the Disinherited is a book that was the fruit of Thurman's answer to the challenge that the Hindu man gave him in 1935 in India. So Thurman writes, what does the religion of Jesus offer to those with their backs against the wall? Thurman began by focusing on Jesus' situation as a poor Jew living in occupied territory with no civil protections, an outsider in his own land. For the Jewish people in Jesus' day, their most urgent concern was their attitude toward Rome. They had to deal with Rome, and Rome was everywhere. No Jewish person of the period could deal with the question of his practical life. Nobody could deal with their own vocation. Nobody could deal with their place in society until they first settled deep within themselves this critical question of, how am I going to live with Rome as the empire and as Caesar occupying my life? Jesus, as a non-citizen, living under a violent and oppressive regime, his life, ministry, and death happened as one with his back against the wall. Now, I hope you all are feeling the shift that took place in Jesus scholarship and in Christian theological reflection by focusing on Jesus's life as a Jew in Roman occupied Israel, Palestine. This totally changes the emphasis and the game on how you develop your Christianity, rather than your first occupation being what tradition tells you about the substance of Jesus, the dogma of the doctrine of the Trinity, on and on and on. No, the focus becomes, what was Jesus's life like? So Thurman's argument was that Jesus, who was subject to the same temptations as every dispossessed person or every disinherited person, and living with his back against the wall, pursued a path distinct from the perils of adopting fear, deception, or hatred as a means of survival. There's a beautiful chapter in this book. So what I'm trying to argue here tonight, and I'm grateful to you all for allowing me to make this presentation, is as a way of teaching all of this. Thank you. I've had to synthesize something that I've never synthesized before. And that is, I'm going to plug myself in so this doesn't happen again. is that Thurman has a spirituality. It is the spirituality of every one of us having the responsibility of being acquainted and familiar with the sound of the genuine in our lives. And what he's arguing is that Jesus did that so that he could obey what my psychiatrist told me back when I was 33, that I could trust the inner divine genius. So one of his famous quotes, if it may be more famous than the sound of the genuine quote, Howard Thurman, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive. And go do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So he said that, well, let's do the blue parts first. So Jesus began with a simple idea that every person is every other person's neighbor, that neighborliness is non-spatial, it is qualitative. A person must love neighbor directly, clearly, permitting no barriers between. And from Thurman's perspective, whatever the Spirit of Jesus appears, wherever the Spirit of Jesus appears, the oppressed gather fresh courage. For Jesus has announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, those three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, or people with their backs against the wall, need have no dominion over them. So in Jesus and the Disinherited, this breakthrough book about the historical Jesus, Thurman insists that to fight and struggle against oppressive powers and principalities requires a spiritual reservoir that can only be filled through the practice of spiritual disciplines like silence and contemplation and meditation and prayer. Jesus recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another person to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of that other person the keys to their destiny. So keep the keys to your destiny in your hands rather than turning them over to somebody who may not be so friendly toward you and your true self. So the top right-hand quote then is designed to be a connection with the three latest forum guests who practiced unconditional compassion and found that it changed the actual force field in which they lived. So here's something written many decades earlier saying, if we practice brotherhood and sisterhood among others, this is one limited step in the direction of a new order, a socially redemptive encounter that we can have daily with other people on the sidewalk, in the subway, in the drugstore. And it softens the climate in all directions. It is leaven that changes all levels of the community and in public and private living. We would then become one of the bulwarks of integrity in human relations in an immoral society. Now, all of us have to be involved in policy issues. And that's the cultural and institutional level of life. We also are called to the interpersonal level of life, where by using unconditional compassion, we literally change another person's life. Next slide. So now we shift to Bishop Spong. Now, I would never have chosen to cover him in these presentations, but Rollin Maloney said, you know, he's been an inspiration. So what do you think about him? Well, let me tell you all about him, and then I'll tell you what I think about it. So his roots are in medieval universalism of Peter Abelard, who is actually one of my heroes. And whenever you hear about Peter Abelard, you also hear about his love life with Eloise, who was in charge of a convent, and they carried on this love relationship. You also think of Saint Anselm, who had him excommunicated and proclaimed him a heretic. And Anselm is the big guy, the big thinker. Some people think, unfortunately, the most successful theologian that we've had, who in the 1100s, articulated the cross, the substitutionary atonement theology for the cross, as opposed to the universalism of love. And his other roots are in the existentialism of Paul Tillich, who said, accept your acceptance. And he calls him his favorite theologian. Jack Spong, still living, born in 1930-something, was the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New York for 24 years before his retirement in 2001. His admirers claim him as a teaching bishop who makes contemporary theology accessible to the ordinary layperson. He's considered the champion of inclusive faith. Now, a prominent theme in Bishop Spong's writing is that the popular and literal interpretations of Christian scripture are not sustainable and do not speak honestly to the situation of modern Christian communities. Now, there's a resonance between him and Howard Thurman, who's saying that as soon as you articulate a dogma or a doctrine from your mind, it's out of date because it's based on an experience you had in the past, and experiences are always bringing you fresh understandings of Jesus and God. Bishop Spong is known as rejecting the historical truth claims of some Christian doctrines like the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He was the critic of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith of the Roman Catholic Church in 2000, who were still affirming that the Catholic doctrine that the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church and that Jesus is the one and only Savior for humanity. Now, we're about to change slides, but let me just let's go to the next slide because I think it's the title of the next slide. No, it's the title of the following, so I'll go ahead and make my point. So Bishop Spong is tough. He's mellower these days, but there was a time where he was very clear about his love-hate relationship with the church. And he didn't mind telling people how wrong they were. And he oftentimes could do it in a pretty condescending way. And one time he had to apologize to the bishops from the African countries at Lambeth because he had been so elitist condescending in demeaning their theology, which he found to be very inferior. Well, he wrote about 30 books. And Why Christianity Must Change or Die, I think probably is his most famous. And his point is that new religious insights always and only emerge out of old traditions as they begin to die. It's not by pitching the old insights out, but by journeying deeply through them into new visions that we're able to change religion's direction. The creeds were 3rd or 4th century love songs that people composed to sing to their understanding of God. We do not have to literalize their words to perceive their meaning or their intention to join in the singing of their creedal song. So he's advocating that people still say the creed or sing the creed, but see it as lyrical, poetic, metaphorical love song and not to believe in it literally. Literalism versus metaphor or symbolism is now going to become a theme for the rest of this PowerPoint. It shows up in a lot of thinkers. So he continues to say, I think religion in general and Christianity in particular must always be evolving. And we're really going to hit on that next week when we summarize having an evolutionary understanding of God. But here's the introduction of the word evolution in tonight's PowerPoint. Forcing the evolution is the dialogue between yesterday's words and today's knowledge. The sin of Christianity. I mean, this is why he's turned so many people off. And I can't help but think he kind of chuckled at this. But nevertheless, he said the sin of Christianity is that any of us ever claimed that we had somehow captured eternal truth in the forms we had created. Now, y'all, in making this PowerPoint, I came across the most fascinating article, and I've given you the link for it. Here is a response by Matthew Fox, who is known for the original blessing theology to counter the original sin theology. Matthew Fox got kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church. He's now an Episcopal priest. By God, we'll take everybody in, as we should. Anyway, Spong wrote 12 points for reform. Now, if this sounds like Martin Luther nailing his theses on the door of the cathedral, yeah, here we go. Brother Jack, I think, would put himself in the category of Martin Luther. Anyway, so he wrote up 12 points for reform. We don't have time to run through to unpack them all, but I thought it would really be good for those of you who keep these PowerPoints to see what they are. One has to do with being an atheism person, not a disbeliever, but understanding that theism is a being, seeing God as a being supernatural in power, dwelling somewhere external to the world and capable of invading the world with miraculous power. He said theism as a way of defining God is dead. He was not part of the God is dead movement, but he's part of the theism is dead movement. Do you see the nuanced difference? Very important. So most theological God talk is today meaningless. So a new way of speaking of God must be found. That's point number one. We're not going to spend that much time on all 12. Since God can no longer be conceived in theistic terms, it becomes nonsensical to seek to understand Jesus as the incarnation of the theistic deity. So the Christology of the ancient years is bankrupt. 3, the biblical story of the perfect and finished creation from which human beings fall into sin or fell into sin is pre-Darwinian mythology and post-Darwinian nonsense. Brother Jack is not going to mince any words, and he's going to call a sin and nonsense, and idiocy in a non-diplomatic way. And we'll contrast him with the gentle, ironic Marcus Borg in just a few minutes. But here are two very different personalities. Next slide. So number 4 is no to the virgin birth, then no to the miracle stories. Then the 6, the view of the cross as the sacrifice for the sins of the world is a barbarian idea based on primitive concepts of God and must be dismissed. Go over to the picture there where he is famously quoted, I have become convinced that we must put an end to atonement theology, for there will be no future for the Christian, or there will be no future for the Christian faith. Now, my friends, of the people we've chosen tonight to talk about after Thurman, they all agree on point number 6, that the theology of substitutionary atonement for sins through the bloody cross and sacrifice to calm down God's anger because we are so sinful, that theology is bankrupt, that every human being is kinder than that God, and that the cross was not about bringing us into reconciliation with God. It was about God's expressing God's love to us, and God doesn't need a sacrifice of his innocent son to forgive us. God's nature is to forgive. As the collect in the prayer book says, your property is always to have mercy. 7, resurrection is an action of God, casting doubt on, Mary Lynn said, phew. So critique of the resurrection, bodily resurrection. Critique of the doctrine of the ascension, because it's a 3-tiered universe basis context. 9, there is no external objective revealed standard written in scripture on the tablets of stone that will govern our ethical behavior for all time. Definitely not a biblical literalist. 10, prayer is not a request you make to a theistic deity to act in human history in a particular way. It is not for us to give God our agenda. Prayer, I'm adding now Ed Bacon and Richard Rohr. Prayer is about God giving us God's agenda, not us giving God God's agenda, particularly a theistic God. 11, critique of hope after a life after death. And 12, very important. And he was so important in the House of Bishops to stand for the ordination of women, the ordination of gay and lesbian folks, and the marriage of gay and lesbian folks, and to counter any systemic racism. So all of us, I think, to a certain degree, can either embrace or quarrel with all of these. Number 12, I think, is going to be something we all embrace. So hence the title of this slide. He's always been controversial. He loves that, I think. And he's sometimes condescending, and he absolutely is a pioneer. And he's still living and doing very well. Next slide. Now we go to somebody who is resonant, but very differently personality. So I give you 3 books here for Marcus Borg. They are 3 of several books that Marcus co-authored with John Dominic Crossan, which we will treat in his own right in a few minutes. But the reason I put these particular 3 together is because they're ones that I go back to and reread over and over again. The Christmas book is a great book about literally what happened and also what the stories of Christmas tell us symbolically. These guys are really going to focus on the symbolic, poetic meaning of Scripture. So just as they talk about the first Christmas, they also talk about the last week, and they take you from Palm Sunday all the way through Easter Sunday and tell you what happened in each day. It's really a great read. And then one of my favorite books of all time, period, is the one called The First Paul. And Marcus and Dominic wrote this together. And clearly it was part of this trilogy. And in it, well, we'll talk about it later when we get to Crossan. So let me just kind of asterisk it right now. Marcus and Dominic are, or Dom, his friends call him, are among the most famous of America's Jesus scholars. And some people claim that Dominic is the most famous. I'm not sure about that. Nevertheless, this is from the New York Times obituary. Unfortunately, our dear brother Marcus went to Jesus back in 2015, I think, maybe later. I want you to know about the Jesus Seminar. That's in that first line. He was a group of scholars who helped found the Jesus Seminar. They set off an uproar with their very public efforts to discern collectively which of Jesus's acts and which of Jesus's words could be confirmed as historically true and which were probably myths. And I have those 2 books, The Acts of Jesus and The Words of Jesus. They are fascinating reading. I read them in preparation for sermons. His studies of the New Testament led him not toward atheism, but toward deep belief in the spiritual life and as Jesus as a teacher, healer, and prophet. Now, Marcus was personal friends of Hope and mine, along with his wife. And he visited me many times in Jackson, Mississippi, and also in Pasadena. And he talked with me about his spiritual life. He clearly was a mystic. He had had mystical experiences throughout his life. So he was not an unbeliever. He became, in essence, a leading evangelist of what is often called progressive Christianity. Wrote or co-wrote 21 books. He was a great writer. He very rarely had to be edited by his editor. He had a really radical message, yes. But here we're talking about a gentle, ironic peacemaker.
Beautiful blue eyes.
Hope said, with beautiful blue eyes. In his last book, the memoir Convictions, How I Learned What Matters Most, he wrote, imagine that Christianity is about loving God. Oh, I love that. Imagine that it's not about the self and the self's concerns, about what's in it for me, whether that be a blessed afterlife or prosperity in this life. No, let's go to the next slide. It's about having a grown-up Christianity. It's about having an adult faith. It's about being a person of compassion. Now, to tell you how ironic he was, he loved public debates with people who disagreed with him, and he did it so beautifully. Now, his most popular debater was Bishop N.T. Wright, a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He was formerly the Bishop of Durham. And N.T. Wright said in the obituary of the New York Times that the two men had often debated the birth of Jesus and the bodily resurrection. And Professor Wright said that he had argued that there's very good historical reason to believe these are things that actually happened, while Professor Borg had believed that they were metaphors. And then somebody else said what thousands of people said about Marcus. Without Marcus, I wouldn't be able to call myself a Christian. Marcus Borg really took the word Christianity and Christian. And for those people who had difficulty using that as an identifier, he went in and unpacked that in a way that they could call themselves a Christian again. He really made that contribution. Next slide. So he made a difference. He differentiated between the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Jesus Christ. I'm sorry, the post-Easter Christ. We're not going to be able to get into this fully tonight, but let me just tell you, because we've really got to put the gas to the pedal, to the metal, pedal to the metal. He says that in the New Testament, in the Gospels, you have words of Jesus who actually said those words. And then you have words that are placed into the mouth of Jesus by people who experienced the risen Christ. So almost in the entire book of John, which is the fourth gospel, is a post-Easter Christ. And everything that is said that Jesus said is an understanding of the risen Christ placed into the lips of the historic Jesus. Now, we don't have time to read all of this, but I give it to you. He said that the historic Jesus really was a spirit person, really was a subversive sage, a wisdom person, a wisdom teacher. He truly was a social prophet. He truly was a movement founder. And he invited his followers and hearers into a transformative relationship with the Spirit. And he was a powerful healer. He was an observant Jew. And he had an experiential relationship with God. He was not a person who believed strongly in God, Jesus of Nazareth, but one who knew God. So that's what the Christian faith and life is all about. Now, the last paragraph there, I can't read, I don't have time for it, but it is to talk about how compassion was central in the life of the historical Jesus, and that the symbol of Jesus's compassion was he invited absolutely everybody to supper all the time. And he never excluded anybody, women, people with mental illness, shepherds who were considered the lowest on the rung of sinners because they couldn't afford to go into the temple to pay the temple tax, on and on, prostitutes, wine bibbers, and Jesus's aggrieved people just criticized him left and right for associating with the worst of the worst. And Jesus said, and then I'm going to quote Howard Thurman, I'm listening to the sound of the genuine in me. Y'all are listening to fear. And I'm going to invite everybody into full table fellowship. Oh my God, that gives me a glory attack. Next slide. So now it's time to talk about, Linda Ricketts said that Jesus and the Disinherited is part of the Sacred Ground curriculum. Yay. So Sacred Ground curriculum. So let me get back to that. And John Dominic Crossan is our next person. born in 1934, still going strong, Irish-American New Testament scholar, got a thick Irish brogue, no longer a Catholic priest. He's married to a beautiful person we'll talk about in just a minute. He was also a prominent member of the Jesus Seminar, over 30 books on the origins of Christianity, historical Jesus, and historical Paul. Now, let's now talk about this book, The First Paul. Here is one of the finest books I've ever read. He says there in all the Pauline letters, all the letters in the New Testament that are ascribed to Paul, there are at least 3 layers of editing going on. That you've got the original Paul, the first Paul, who he said was quite radical. And then the next layer, the next generation of people who said, oh no, we're in the church of Paul, but he's gone too far on that. So we've got to trim him, calm him down a little bit. And so they put in some glosses from here and there. And then a third group of people who said, oh, that's still too radical. And they calmed that down. Now, Dom Crossan has such a familiarity with the original Greek that he's able to analyze syntactically and in terms of the vocabulary what was Brother Paul. And a very good example is, he said, it's pure Paul to say, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. But then later people came in and said, ooh, that's a little too radical. Let's talk about women being silent in church. And let's talk about them covering their heads in church. And let's talking about their being obedient to their husbands. Dominic Crossan is saying that those second and third layers of editing, which give us what we have in Paul now, not the original Paul. Now, another point that Crossan makes is that ancient people, when they were ready to create something that told the truth, like literal stories and deep truths, they told them symbolically. And we are dumb enough to take them literally. Next slide. So there are lots of great books. One of my favorite books of his is How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian. There's another book called God and Empire, which goes back to, interestingly enough, Thurman's notion that to understand Jesus is to understand that he lived in an oppressive, occupying Roman Empire. I loved it. Elizabeth Schaus-Caffey talked about empire in her sermon this past Sunday. She was benefiting from all of this Jesus scholarship about that. And I gave you at the top a very good website created by friends of mine in Jackson, Mississippi, interestingly enough, who were close friends of Dominic Crossan. And it's called Faith and Reason. It has absolutely everything having to do with Crossan there. So, but then I wanted to, he's got a great book called Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. And I'm quoting from it: for Jesus, the kingdom of God is a community of radical or unbrokered equality. That goes back to the point that Borg was making about compassion, in which individuals are in direct contact with one another and with God. And that contact, connection and contact, very important to Crossan, unmediated by any established brokers or fixed locations. Everybody, back to Thurman, can have an encounter with another person and treat them as their neighbor. And what that does is it sets up, now I'm going to use 21st century language, it sets up a change and a shift in energy in the force field, and you literally begin to change the culture because you've had an encounter with somebody that's based in compassion. Okay, the next slide, which I think is the last slide about Crossan. So here is something very exciting about what Dom has been doing just recently. Here's his wife, Sarah Sexton Crossan, in the top right-hand picture. And they have been absolutely taken by icons about the Easter event, about resurrection, that are found in Eastern churches, not in Western churches. So in the West, Jesus is a lone figure coming out of the grave by himself. In Eastern churches, you remember we split from the East and the West in 1054. The Eastern churches show Christ always surrounded by others, and he's pulling them out of death. And he is rising from the dead, and he's creating resurrection for other people. It is a communal, not a lone individualistic experience. Praise Jesus. Oh, I'm having an authority attack. This led the Crossans to question why Western churches depict an individual resurrection of Jesus, whereas Eastern church icons show a universal resurrection for Jesus and all humanity together, so that nobody's not resurrected. Jesus is pulling everybody out of death. So they've been spending thousands of air miles going to find these icons that show Jesus pulling people out of death. And you see the most famous one underneath them there, but there's one to the far left as well. And the name of their latest book is Resurrecting Easter. And it's a lot of artwork that shows you these beautiful icons. So he says, the crucifixion resurrection story is not simply about Jesus clashing with or triumphing over Pilate, but about a hopeful option for humanity to find a way out of the violence-based civilization it has created for itself. It's hope for everybody. Next slide. So we come to the absolutely wonderful, delightful woman religious by the name of Joan Chittister, who has OSB after her name. I want to find out what Judith Smith just said. She said something about, actually, many of our Easter anthems do talk about Jesus resurrecting everybody. Yeah, that's the point. And they're just documenting it.
Choir knows all.
Yay, choir members. So her website says she has a passion for God, a passion for justice, and a passion for life. Y'all, if you're ever around Sister Joan, you are going to be infused with passion. And those three things, God, justice, and life. She's amazing. She's written 30 books or more. And one of the essential statements of hers is find the thing that stirs your heart and then make room for it. Now that's very much like Howard Thurman, who said, find out what makes you come alive, because that's what the world needs, is for you to come alive. Next slide. So I really think that Sister Joan illustrates a Christianity that's world focused. She's interested in redeeming the world. And here are just 3 memes that I thought would really be cool for you to know. Everything is translated into world care. From contemplation. Contemplation is a very dangerous activity. It not only brings us face to face with God, it brings us as well face to face with the world, face to face with the self. And then, of course, something must be done. Nothing stays the same once we have found the God within. Howard Thurman, The Sound of the Genuine, my psychiatrist, the divine inner genius. Once you hook up with the God within, everything changes. We carry the world in our hearts, the oppression of all peoples, the suffering of friends, the burdens of our enemies, the raping of the earth, the hunger of the starving, and the joy of every laughing child. Not only is contemplation world focused, but leadership. The purpose of leadership is not to make the present bearable. The purpose of leadership is to make the future possible. Not only contemplation and leadership, but community. It is in community that we come to see God in the other. It is in community that we see our own emptiness filled up. It is community that calls me beyond the pinched horizons of my own life, my own country, my own race, and gives me the gifts I do not have within me. Now, I've got to comment on the word pinched there. Pinched or narrow is actually the way the word Egypt is translated. Egypt was a pinched existence for those enslaved by Pharaoh, and God brought them out through the Exodus experience. Next slide. So I'm putting this here. I was thinking about saying it, but I'm not going to because of our time. We only have 5 minutes, and I want us to have our own prayer time and see if we have any questions. But I would offer this litany of women for the church. Sister Joan is very much a feminist, and she really holds up the very, very important theology of the feminine face of God. So let's all come back, take away the PowerPoint. Let us see one another's faces. Thank you all for being here tonight. What a great, great gathering. This is the biggest class we've ever had, I think. And let's see if anybody wants to say anything and have any questions or comments. You can place them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and comment or ask questions.